Hello, everyone. I am quite honored to be able to speak to you all today. I have been introduced as a researcher in Buddhist studies at Ryukoku University, but I am also an activist in Buddhist-based suicide prevention. So I would like to share with you some things I have learned through this work. When Buddhists get involved in this work of suicide prevention, it is very important that they first confront the question, what kind of death is suicide? And furthermore, is it firmly a negative death or not so? Or is it neither? Let me briefly introduce myself. I am a priest in the Jodo Shin Pure Land Hongan-ji denomination. In 2010, with Reverend Takemoto, who will speak later this afternoon, we helped to form Sotto, the Kyoto Self-Death and Suicide Counseling Center. It is based around telephone consultations and is staffed on Friday and Saturday evenings from 7 p.m. to 1 a.m. by a total of 105 volunteers and 5 full-time staff. We also do some email counseling all year long without break and will reply within 3 days to these emails. Finally, we also offer some grief support programs. I would like to tell you how I got involved in this work. I realized the importance of it about 6 years ago when the WHO published a report called Preventing Suicide, a Global Imperative. I realized one key thing from this report was that people often have no place to reach out to when their situation becomes dire. This is often due to a strong stigma and taboo associated with suicide, especially in Japan. About 10 years ago, people started pointing this out. For example, in this Mainichi newspaper article from 2009, reported that at a Buddhist funeral, the priest said, quote, "A person who throws their life away cannot rest in peace." And also, quote, "Since we cannot accept suicide, such a person will fall into hell," end quote. Maybe this condition has changed since then, and not all priests are like this, but we have heard similar such stories like this from some of the cases we work with, such as priests attaching stigmatized Chinese characters, such as jikai, self-banned, or shireru, stupid, to the deceased person's posthumous name to show that they had committed suicide, or a priest charging extra money to make a memorial tablet for a person who committed suicide, or even further, a priest refusing to do a funeral for a child who had committed suicide and telling the family they could not inter the child's ashes in the family cemetery plot. In this way, I realized that this report by the WHO was in fact talking about the condition in my own country. I would now like to briefly review the activities of Buddhist priests in Japan to engage in suicide prevention. In the late 1990s, the annual suicide rate in Japan rapidly increased due to economic decline, and in 1998 stood at 32,863, beginning the era of 30,000 suicides. At the moment, the number is around 20,000, but due to the dislocations caused by COVID, the numbers are increasing again. So by the late 1990s, suicide started to be seen as an important social issue in Japan. Some of the first work in this area was done by a Sotto Zen priest in the northern prefecture of Akita, named Reverend Toshihide Hakamata, who began the Thinking About Life and Mind Association in 2000. Another Sotto Zen priest named Reverend Eiichi Shinohara in Chiba Prefecture began a nonprofit called the Kaze Suicide Prevention Network in 2003. In 2007, the first pan-sectarian network of such priests was formed, called the Association of Priests Confronting Suicide, which has since been renamed the Association of Priests Confronting Self-Death and Suicide. Also during this time, various other citizens groups, as well as the government, developed programs and policies to confront suicide. Also, following these individual priests, entire denominations started to develop suicide prevention programs, such as the headquarters of the Nichiren sect and its affiliated research institute in 2004, the Jodo Shin Pure Land Hongan-ji sect in 2007, and the Kodo Kyodan Buddhist Fellowship in 2008. The holding of special memorial services called Sito Hoyo for those who have committed suicide and their grieving families were also initiated by such denominations as the Jodo Pure Land sect, the Tendai sect, and the Sotto Zen sect. In this way, Buddhist denominations began to systematically confront this issue in the mid to late 2000s. However, as it had already been recognized as a social problem, why were the Buddhists so late in responding? I think the reason has to do with the issue of doctrine in Japanese Buddhist sects. They see death by suicide as evil, aku, sinful, tsumi, or taboo, kinki. This included myself back 10 years ago. One year, at the gathering of the association to bring together the various research institutes of each sect, we discussed this issue and a great debate broke out on the doctrinal stances towards suicide. At our Jodo Shin Pure Land Hongan-ji Research Institute, we conducted a survey in 2009 of the 10,281 affiliated temples of our denomination and found that among the 2,694 priests who responded, 68.7% felt that suicide is an act of throwing away one's life. 74.1% felt that suicide is against Buddhist teachings. Yet only 15% had actually provided counseling to anyone who was suicidal. In short, Buddhist priests have a negative understanding of suicide. It seems then that the more priests hold this negative view of suicide from their respective doctrines, the less they actually provide counseling to their lay members. So the question then arises, where did this poor understanding come from? This is a very deep and complex issue, which I don't have time to discuss in detail today. But first, we should look at the basic terminology of the word in Japanese. In the 2000s, in Japan, primarily in the field of support for grieving families, a shift occurred in speaking about suicide from self-killing, jisatsu, to self-death, jishi. As suicide occurs due to a wide range of causes, such as economic and social factors, it cannot be encompassed as an individual's problem for grieving families who have lost someone important to them. To speak of having killed sounds as if the deceased are being negated. So which of these terms shall we use? In order to answer this question, I would like to look at a case study from 2013 in the remote rural prefectures of Shimane and Tottori, located on the Sea of Japan, in which a problem resulted in the use of these terms in providing counseling. In official government documents there, self-killing, jisatsu, was used as the standardized term. There was an article published in the Nihon Keizai newspaper on March 3, 2013, entitled Shimane, a request by grieving families to change suicide to self-death, that brought this issue to public attention. By the 30th of the same month, it was decided in Shimane to change the title of the next 5-year comprehensive policy for measures to prevent suicide to Comprehensive Policy Measures to Prevent Self-Death. In all public documents, in principle, the term self-killing jisatsu would no longer be used and be changed to self-death jishi. According to the prefectural government, this was in response to strong requests made by grieving families that we want the phrase self-killing jisatsu to be no longer used. There were, however, critical voices that arose at the same time towards this association. They felt that in any event, there should not be a standardized term used for this, either jisatsu or jishi. So these questions remain today in Japanese society. Should there be a unified term or not? In this way, I became interested in the historical development of these terms in Japanese. I discovered there was a wide variety of them used to refer to endings one life in our history, such as self-determination, self-harm, self-judgment, self-annihilation, cutting one's throat, suicide by sword, self-death, renouncing the flesh, many of them. Whatever the expression, there was never a direct negative or pejorative sense in all these old historical terms. In this way, I believe that the act of choosing death intentionally by oneself changed according to the historical era, and the present negative critical meaning that we have nowadays has only been recently inserted. I would like to show an example of this from some documents from the 8th and 9th centuries during the Heian period in Japan. According to two famous historical texts from the 8th century, known as the Kojiki and the Nihonshiki, as well as, quote, the miraculous stories from Japanese Buddhist tradition, known as the Nihon Ryo-iki, there are various expressions used for self-death, jishi, to die by oneself, mizukara shizu, such as jigai, self-harm, and other words to indicate the act of severing one's life. On the other hand, in the literature of this era, you cannot find examples of the popular term that's used now, jisatsu. There are more interesting examples after the 10th century, from the Kamakura to Edo periods. From the beginning of the Kamakura period, the expression self-death, jishi, changes and self-killing, jisatsu, appears more frequently. However, it is not that jishi, self-death, is ever not used anymore. We find that they are both commonly used. Then, in the Edo period, during the 16th and 17th centuries, jisatsu again is used more frequently and comes more into general use among the common literary arts. However, things really change in the modern era, in the Meiji and Taisho periods of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. A decisive change took place in the expression of self-death, jishi. Looking at the newspapers, popular literature, and other publications, jishi, for the most part, completely disappears and is replaced by the fixed term self-killing, jisatsu. For example, doing a comprehensive search in the Kikuzo database of the Asahi newspaper, one of Japan's oldest newspapers, we find 25,116 articles that use the term self-killing, jisatsu, over a 110-year period from 1879 to 1989, the earliest recorded usage from 1887. Under the same search, only 18 articles containing the term jishi, self-death, appeared, with the oldest one dating back to 1882. Another search of publications in the database of the National Diet Library digital collection found only 5 entries in publications during the Meiji and Taisho eras that used the phrase self-death, jishi. In this way that we see that jishi, which had been used so widely before the Meiji era, basically disappears, and self-killing, jisatsu, becomes the common term. The question then, of course, arises, why did this change take place? My hypothesis is that it is a problem that revolves around the translation of English texts. During the Meiji period, there was an influx of legal and religious texts that were introduced to Japan from England, France, and Germany. In the process of translating into Japanese the English terms self-murder and kill oneself, the original text had a negative connotation towards severing life. It seems there was thus an intentional decision to select the term self-killing, jisatsu, which included the word to kill, satsu, over the term self-death, jishi. For example, we look at this text that is introducing English criminal law, published in 1874 under the title Essentials of English Criminal Law, and it included a passage criticizing suicide as a violation of God's will. In the highlighted text on the right, you can see that next to the Chinese character for murder, satsugai, is a reading reference in the Japanese phonetic katakana script for reading foreign terms that reads serufu mada, or self-murder. Another example is found in the translation of the French philosopher Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, de l'Esprit des Lois, published in French in 1748 and Japanese in 1875. In Chapter 14, in the section on dwelling on the law to prevent suicide, there is an emphasis on the psychological cause of suicide and its sinfulness. In translating this passage, the word self-killing, jisatsu, was chosen. Now, in terms of how this affected the Buddhist world, from about the time of 1897 onward, a strong criticism developed in society at large towards Buddhism, and especially Pure Land orders, about Buddhism being too pessimistic, and this pessimism being one of the causes leading to self killing, jisatsu. This was especially as a response to the suicides of Fujimura Misao, a philosophy student and poet, largely remembered due to his farewell poem in 1903, and Count Nogi Maresuke, also known as Kiten, Count Nogi, who was a Japanese general in the Imperial Japanese Army and a governor general of Taiwan, who killed himself in 1912. In the process of developing a counter-argument to this, Buddhists started emphasizing that self-killing jisatsu is against Buddhist teaching. In the early Showa period, beginning in the mid-1920s, a famous writer called Ryunosuke Akutagawa, who is regarded as the father of the Japanese short story, committed self-death, jishi. In his suicide note, he said, quote, "I do not feel self-killing jisatsu is sinful in the way that Westerners believe. The Buddha allowed the jisatsu of one of his disciples as evidenced in the Agama Sutras." End quote. From this point, Buddhist priests and researchers began to have a debate on whether or not Buddhist texts affirm or negated self-killing jisatsu, and concluded that Buddhism does not allow it. In these next few slides, I have documented the work of various Buddhist scholars from the early Showa period up to more recent times on this issue, and such as whether suicides found in classical Buddhist texts are negative acts or not. While many of them accept a certain nuance in the various cases and contexts cited, they all generally say that Buddhism denies suicide. However, the problem I found in all these texts and discussions is the rather simplistic binary viewpoint of either being opposed or accepting of suicide. And this type of narrow-minded debate is still being carried on today. In conclusion, I would like to point out that these are important philosophical issues for those who are trying to take measures to deal with jishi. However, we should point out that one of the origins of the problem today is the definitive change in the image of jishi since the beginning of the modern period towards a purely negative view. This modern framework for talking about jishi in such black and white terms is problematic, most importantly for those actually struggling with self-death, as well as their loved ones. For contemporary Japanese Buddhists, jishi countermeasures such as deep listening work, special memorial services, and such can truly provide an important change, but they have to proceed at a fixed distance from this kind of black and white framework. One cannot develop support from the standpoint that jishi is taboo. We must not deny jishi and the suffering that comes from it, but rather move towards a society that can recognize a variety of ways of living and dying. I feel we can find the essential point of contact with Buddhism at this place. Thank you very much.